I'd like to call this briefing to order. This briefing of the Committee on Foreign Affairs will come to order at 10:06 in the morning. Unfortunately, our chairwoman, Ileana Ross-Latham, is unable to be in Washington this week. She is at her family's side. Her mother is in failing health from complications with Alzheimer's, and so I would ask that we all remember she and her mother and her family in this very troubled time. It's very difficult to lose a loved one, especially a parent. And so Ileana asked me to chair this briefing, and I was very gracious and happy to accept. I will now recognize myself for 7 minutes to read the chairman's opening statement, which should be considered attributable to her. As I said, this is her statement, this committee's last hearing on the United Nations reform, quote, with significant leadership by the United States, the United Nations was founded on high ideals. Quote, the pursuit of international peace and development and the promotion of basic human rights are core historic concerns of American people. At its best, the UN can play an important role in promoting U.S. interests and international security, but reality hasn't matched the ideals. End quote. According to the United States policy on the United Nations, should be based on three fundamental questions. Are we advancing the American interests? Are we upholding American values? Are we being responsible stewards for the American taxpayer dollars? Unfortunately, right now, the answer to all three questions is no. Here's the simple math. With no strings attached, we pay all contributions that the United Nations assesses to us, 20% of their annual budget, plus billions more every year. According to the OMB, the fiscal year 2009, the U.S. contributed well over $6 billion to the UN at a time of high unemployment, skyrocketing deficits, crushing debt, and other great economic and fiscal challenges to our nation. And what have we gotten in return from the UN? Well, here are a few examples. The UN Development Program fired a whistleblower who revealed that the United Nations Development Program's office in North Korea was not being managed properly and was being exploited by Kim Jong-il's regime. In 2008, a Senate subcommittee found that the UN Development Program's local staff was selected by the regime, and the UNDP paid the staff salaries directly to the regime in foreign currency with no way to know whether the funds weren't being diverted to enrich the regime. The UNDP prevented proper oversight and undermined whistleblower protections by limiting access to its audits and refusing to submit to the UN's Ethics Office jurisdiction. The regime used its relationship with the UNDP to move money outside North Korea, and the UNDP transferred funds to a company tied to an entity designated by the U.S. as North Korea's financial agent for weapons sales. The UNDP briefly pulled out of North Korea, but now they're back, and this time they can select staff from a list of 3 candidates handpicked by the regime, not just one. That's what passes for reform in the UN. The U.S. taxpayers are also paying 1/5 of the bills for the UN's anti-Israeli activities, including the UN Human Rights Council, a rogues gallery dominated by human rights violators who use it to ignore real abuses and instead attack democratic Israel relentlessly. The council was also the fountainhead for the infamous Durban II conference and the Goldstone report. One more example. An independent procurement task force uncovered cases of corruption tainting hundreds of millions of dollars in UN contracts. In response, the UN shut down the task force. When the head of the UN's Oversight Office tried to hire the chairman of the task force, former U.S. prosecutor Robert Appleton, as the top investigator, the UN Secretary General blocked it. Well, the UN may not want him. Well, we're pleased to have Mr. Appleton here today. Ironically, the UN's current chief investigator, who has reportedly failed to pursue cases, is now under investigation himself for retaliating against whistleblowers. Ambassador Susan Rice says the U.S.'s approach to the UN is, quote, "We pay our bills, we push for real reform," end quote. Instead, we should be conditioning our contributions on reform first, pay later. In the past, Congress has gone along by willingly paying what successive administrations asked for without enough oversight. This is one of the first true UN reform hearings held by this committee in almost 4 years, but it won't be the last. Right now, the vast majority of countries at the UN General Assembly pay next to nothing in assessed contributions, creating a pervasive incentive because those who make decisions don't have to pay the bills. So, I, meaning Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, am going to reintroduce legislation that conditions our contributions, our strongest leverage on real, sweeping reform, including moving the UN regular budget to a voluntary funding basis. That way, U.S. taxpayers can pay for the UN programs and activities that advance our interests and our values. And if other countries want different things to be funded, they can pay for it themselves. This will encourage competition, competence, and effectiveness. The voluntary model works for UNICEF and many other UN agencies, and it can work for the UN as a whole. One more point. Some of the UN's defenders like to cite some good UN activities to gain support for funding bad ones. However, we're not here to play let's make a deal with hard-earned U.S. taxpayer dollars. Each UN office activity, program, and subprogram, country by country and function by function, must be justified on its own merits. UNICEF programs to help starving children cannot excuse the United Nations Relief and Work Agencies having members of Hamas on its payroll. The World Health Organization's vaccination programs cannot excuse the Human Rights Council biased actions. My colleagues, reforming the UN should not be a Republican or Democratic issue. It is in the interest of all Americans. And so I hope and trust that the UN reform efforts will be strongly bipartisan. That concludes the chairwoman's opening remarks. Following the opening remarks of our ranking member, we will follow the protocol of other briefings in this Congress and proceed directly to oral statements by our presenters. I am now pleased to recognize our distinguished ranking member, Mr. Bierman, for his opening remarks.
Madam Chairwoman, thank you very much for yielding me this time. And initially, let me say that I think all of us, our thoughts and our prayers are with Ileana as she's by her mother's side at this very difficult time, and understand why she's not here. Madam Chairwoman, the flaws, shortcomings, and outrages of the United Nations, both past and present, are numerous and sometimes flagrant. These include the Human Rights Council's obsession with and biased treatment of Israel. As the chairwoman pointed out, the membership, a rogues gallery of human rights abusers who have worked to hijack that organization's agenda. The anti-Israel vitriol spewed from innumerable UN platforms, led by the Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People. The oil for food scandal, sexual violence perpetrated by UN peacekeepers, the unnecessarily high vacancy rates and other problems at the Office of Internal Oversight Services, and the overlapping jurisdiction of agencies, the duplication of services, and inefficient procurement practices of the UN as a whole. And like almost all Americans, I'm repelled by these examples of corruption, mismanagement, and bias. But there is another side to the UN ledger, and it's wrong to ignore it. The United Nations often plays an essential role in supporting American foreign policy and national security interests. From UNDP's work organizing the recent referendum in South Sudan, to the wonderful work of the UNHCR in its efforts to protect and resettle refugees, to the Security Council resolutions imposing sanctions on Iran, the UN acts as a force multiplier for U.S. interests. During the Bush administration, we saw a significant rise in UN peacekeeping costs. Why? Because President Bush understood that having blue helmets on the ground reduced or eliminated the need for U.S. troops. The UN peacekeeping presence in Haiti is perhaps the clearest example of how the UN system advances our own interests at a far lower cost than direct U.S. intervention. In an analysis of that UN force, the Government Accountability Office concluded it would cost twice as much for the U.S. to carry out a similar peacekeeping mission using our own troops. So what should we do about the many shortcomings we've referenced? I strongly believe that the best way to successfully achieve the improvements that are needed is to work with our allies to constructively engage the UN on a reform agenda. Experience has shown that this strategy is much more effective than withholding our dues. Not only did previous attempts to force us into arrears at the UN fail to achieve the significant reforms that have taken place in the last few years, but they severely weakened our diplomatic standing. Had we been in such deep arrears last year, does anyone honestly think it would not have impeded our ability to get an additional round of Iran sanctions through the Security Council? The many reform efforts currently underway in New York, Geneva, and elsewhere in the UN system are a testament to the strategy developed under both the Bush and Obama administrations to work with the UN to enact common sense reforms, many of which were laid out in a 2005 report co-authored by former Speaker Newt Gingrich and Senator George Mitchell. The fruits of the Gingrich-Mitchell work were clearly evident with the establishment of the UN Ethics Office 4 years ago. The same can be said about the creation of an independent audit advisory committee, a body now headed by former U.S. Comptroller General David Walker, to review the activities of the Office of International Oversight Services and the UN Board of Auditors. The recent creation of the UN Women Organization and the UN's Delivering as One pilot initiative have demonstrated the UN's determination to remedy the fragmentation and organizational incoherence that have plagued parts of the UN system and has resulted in overlapping mandates, lack of coordination, waste of resources. Much more remains to be done to develop a fully transparent and financially accountable budget process, strengthen program monitoring and evaluation, streamline the UN Secretariat, promote a strong culture of ethics and accountability, and encourage UN agencies to work together to achieve greater cost savings. But make no mistake about it, there has been progress on the reform front. I would also like to take a moment to further discuss the issue of the UN Human Rights Council. As we all know, the Council was created to replace the thoroughly discredited Human Rights Commission. Unfortunately, the previous administration chose not to constructively engage the Council in its early days, thus ceding the organization to the same bloc of nations who take advantage of every opportunity to attack and delegitimize Israel in international fora. I supported the Obama administration's decision to join the Council in the hopes of reforming the organization and transforming it into a serious voice on human rights in the UN system. In less than 2 years, progress has been made on the Council. The U.S. has used its voice as the leading global advocate for human rights to push strong Council action on a number of significant human rights abuses, from the ethnic violence in Kyrgyzstan to the recent standoff in Ivory Coast. And the Obama administration deserves significant credit for its successful diplomatic campaign to deny Iran a seat on the Council. Notwithstanding these important accomplishments, the anti-Israel vitriol that all too often emanates from the Council and the inclusion of serious human rights violators among the Council's membership remains a deep stain on the UN's reputation. Madam Chairwoman, in closing, let me just say again that I agree with you that the UN needs significant reforms. Where I think we differ in our approach is the best way to achieve those reforms. Based on our experience in recent years, I would argue that we have a much greater chance of success if we work inside the UN with like-minded nations to achieve the goals that I think both sides on this committee and in our Congress share. And with that, I yield back my remaining time.
Thank you very much, Congressman Bierman. The chair is pleased to welcome our 6 presenters. Mr. Brett Schaefer is the J. Kingman Fellow in International Regulatory Affairs at the Heritage Foundation's Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom, focusing primarily on the UN. He previously served at the Pentagon as an assistant for International Criminal Court Policy from March of 2003 to March of 2004. Ms. Claudia Rosette, is it Rosette? Rosette, like a rose, is a journalist in residence with the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. She previously worked for 18 years at the Wall Street Journal. Mr. Hillel Neuer is an international lawyer and the executive director of UN Watch, a human rights NGO in Geneva. He previously practiced commercial and civil rights litigation in New York and served as a law clerk for an Israeli Supreme Court justice. We are pleased to welcome Mr. Peter Yo back to the committee. He is currently the Vice President for Public Policy and Public Affairs of the UN Nations Foundation and Executive Director of the Foundation's Better World campaign. Mr. Yo previously served for 10 years as the Deputy Staff Director on the committee's Democratic staff, first then for Ranking Member Sam Ginson, then for our late Chairman Tom Lantos, and for our current ranking member, Mr. Bierman, while he was chairman. Another former Foreign Affairs Committee alum will brief us today, Mr. Mark Quarterman. He is currently Senior Advisor and Director of the Program on Crisis, Conflict, and Cooperation at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Mr. Quarterman previously served at the UN in a number of capacities for almost 12 years, including as Chief of Staff to the UN Commission of Inquiry into the assassination of the former Prime Minister of Pakistan, and in the UN's Office of Legal Affairs and Department of Political Affairs. Before that, Mr. Quarterman served as a staff member for our committee's Africa Subcommittee and as a program officer at the Ford Foundation for South Africa and Namibia. Last but not least, Mr. Robert Appleton served as the chairman of the United Nations Procurement Task Force, a specially created anti-corruption unit that conducted hundreds of investigations of fraud and corruption in the UN. He also served as a special counsel and deputy chief legal counsel into the Independent Inquiry Committee investigation into the UN Oil for Food program, also known as Volcker Committee. More recently, he was selected to serve as the lead investigator for the UN's Office of International Oversight Services, but his selection was not approved, and we'll no doubt hear more about that later. Mr. Appleton served for about 13 years as an assistant United States attorney in the District of Connecticut, prosecuting a wide range of national and international federal criminal offenses. Mr. Appleton presently serves as Director of Investigations and Senior Legal Counsel in the Office of the Inspector General in the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, Tuberculosis, and Malaria in Geneva. Mr. Appleton is presenting his remarks in his personal capacity. Again, the Chair thanks all of our briefers and will remind them to keep their respective oral summaries to no more than 5 minutes each. And having watched Mrs. Roth-Latham for one time, I know she's adamant about the 5-minute rule, so I might give you a few seconds over, but don't test the waters. Anyway, thank you all for coming, and right now I believe we will go, Mr. Schaefer, we will hear your testimony.
I'd like to thank the committee for inviting me to today's briefing. The past 6 decades have seen dozens of reform proposals both from inside the United Nations and outside. For the most part, these reforms have been ignored, cosmetic, watered down, or defeated outright. As a result, the UN and many of its affiliated organizations remain hindered by outdated or duplicative mandates and missions, poor management practices, ineffectual oversight, and a general lack of accountability. A key reason for the lack of reform in the UN is the practice of granting equal voting rights to each nation over budgetary and management issues, even though they have vastly different financial contributions. The bulk of UN member states simply do not pay enough to the UN for mismanagement, corruption, or inefficiency to concern them. For instance, Sierra Leone is assessed 0.001% of the UN regular budget and 0.0001% of the peacekeeping budget. The U.S., by contrast, is assessed 22% and 27.14% respectively. Therefore, while Sierra Leone and the dozens of other organizations with similar assessments pay less than $35,000 per year to the UN in these budgets, the U.S. pays billions of dollars. With this in mind, it's hardly surprising that the U.S. cares deeply about how the UN is managed and how those funds are used, but most countries simply don't care very much about it. Yet these are the countries that possess most of the votes. The combined assessments of the 128 least assessed countries to the United Nations, enough to pass those budgets, totals less than 1% of the UN regular budget and less than 1/3 of 1% to the UN peacekeeping budget. These countries, combined with influential voting blocs, can and do block U.S. attempts to implement reforms and curtail budgets. The U.S. can't fix this problem with diplomacy alone. Moreover, while American administrations are often interested in pressing for reform, the reform agenda is frequently abandoned in favor of short-term political objectives. That is why the State Department is rarely aggressive in pressing for reform at the UN. The reluctance to press for UN reform occurs under most administrations, but it has been particularly apparent over the past few years under the Obama administration as it sought to distance itself from the previous administration's policies at the UN. Criticism of the UN is rarely uttered by Obama administration officials, and its UN reform agenda is notable only for its lack of detail and enthusiasm. Luckily, UN reform doesn't necessarily require an eager administration. Past successful UN reform efforts have shared one thing in common: congressional involvement backed by the threat of financial withholding. Congressional intervention led to U.S. budgetary restraint in the 1980s and 1990s. It led the UN to create the Office of Internal Oversight Services, the first Inspector General equivalent in the history of the United Nations, and it led the U.S. to reduce U.S. assessments earlier this decade. Regrettably, Congress has neglected its oversight role in recent years. Only a handful of UN oversight hearings have been held, and UN reform legislation has not been seriously considered. Without Congress spurring action, the UN has been free to disregard calls for reform. Meanwhile, U.S. contributions are at an all-time high. Congressional scrutiny is overdue. Let me finish my statement by highlighting some reforms that I think deserve particular attention. First, the divorce between obligations and decision-making is perhaps the greatest impediment to UN reform. The U.S. unsuccessfully pressed for weighted voting in the 1980s and got consensus voting on budgetary issues as a compromise. That compromise has since been shattered, and the budget has been passed over U.S. objections. Congress needs to revisit the issue and consider options to increase the influence of major contributors over the UN budget. Second, the UN regular budget has grown even faster than the U.S. budget over the past decade. A few things could be done to curtail that growth and streamline the budget. First, reestablishing the zero nominal growth policy for the United States toward the UN regular budget, which would prevent further increases in the future and lead to a gradual reduction through inflation. Second, sunsetting all UN mandates and revitalizing the mandate review. Nearly all UN mandates remain unreviewed, but if the preliminary reports are indicative, up to half of UN mandates could be outdated or irrelevant. Finally, the Human Rights Council continues to disappoint. The key problem with the Council is the membership. Congress should withhold U.S. funding to the Council until credible and serious membership standards are adopted, including forcing regional groupings to provide competitive slates for elections. In conclusion, if the U.S. does not press this issue and back diplomatic carrots with financial sticks, UN reform will continue to be sound and fury with little substance. The UN is patient. It will publish reports and promise reforms. Action will always be imminent, but rarely realized. Nothing perseveres like bureaucratic inertia. I have a whole stack of UN reports on my desk to prove the point that UN reform is always promised, very rarely implemented. If Congress wants reforms, it must heed the history and demand quick action and link specific reforms to financial withholding. The UN may have 5 official languages, but the bottom line speaks loudest. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your question.
Thank you very much. You are right on time. Next, we have Ms. Claudia Rosette, journalist in resident at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. And will begin when you begin.
I'm ready to begin. Thank you.
Thank you.
My thanks to the committee for the chance to speak here today. The United Nations is enormous, opaque, labyrinthine, and a collective in which the U.S., as Brett has just described, basically sustains the system. The contributions that the United States make are more than the sum of their parts. It's not just roughly 1/4 of the system-wide budget, whatever that is. It's also U.S. credibility, gravitas, the headquarters, things that basically mean the U.S. provides, in effect, the fixed costs. Others hop a ride. And this is a system which invites waste, fraud, and abuse. But what I'd like to highlight here today is that the problem goes well beyond simple theft or waste. The UN is not like a pilfering clerk. It's an organization, unlike many, which operates across borders with immunities, moving large amounts of goods, personnel, services, and so on. It's basically immune to censure. It's really under no jurisdiction of local law. This is a system that invites exploitation. And what we have seen over the years is that the worst of the worst, regimes like the former regime in Iraq, like North Korea today, become very good at exploiting this. The problem I would like to describe is that the U.S. is sustaining a system in which a lot of harm can be done even without drawing directly on U.S. money. That, for instance, was oil for food. Oil for food did not take U.S. tax dollars. It ran on Iraqi oil money. But the UN, via oil for food, having put sanctions on Iraq, then provided cover and sustained a program which became a worldwide bonanza of graft. It ended up corrupting the UN itself and corrupting thousands. There was companies around the world, payments to suicide bombers, purchase of conventional weapons, if not WMD. And the head of the program was alleged in the end to have been on the take for $147,000, peanuts by UN standards, but enough if it's somebody who's running a significant UN program so that it has at least the effect that he will not blow the whistle. How do you find out what's going on inside the UN with that kind of leverage? In my experience, it almost always requires some kind of very energetic investigation. The UN does not readily give information up. In oil for food, we discovered a lot because documents spilled out of Baghdad after the fall of Saddam. In North Korea, it took very energetic efforts over strenuous objections from the UN Development Program by the then Ambassador for Reform, UN Management and Reform at the UN, Mark Wallace, who really went to the mat pointing out troubles, and when this lone whistleblower came forward who was then fired. And in the end, what emerged was just this incredible nest of malfeasance. I've described it in my written statement, but you had, and Chairman Schmidt described it in her opening remarks, you had North Korean employees handling the checkbook and the accounts in Pyongyang. You had transfers on behalf of other agencies via an entity tied to North Korean proliferation. You had the import of dual-use items into North Korea. There's an exhibit in the back of my written testimony showing you how the spectrometers, global mapping systems, satellite receiving stations imported by the UN Development Program into North Korea could have been used to make missiles, which is one of North Korea's big proliferation businesses. When this all surfaced, the UNDP has also been involved in a Burmese currency fiddle, which tells us much. I'm happy to answer questions on that. It was not broken by the UN. It was broken by a blogger who covers the UN, Matthew Russell Lee. When the Cash for Kim scandal broke in North Korea, Secretary General Ban Ki-moon promised a system-wide inquiry, independent inquiry. He backed off that within the week. It has never been held. It was a very good idea. As you just heard, the UN issues endless promises of reform. I've made some recommendations about that in the back. The Secretary General was just boasting last week that he actually requires senior officials now at the UN to disclose their financial information. I have two exhibits in the back of my written statement which show you what that amounts to. One of them is a sheet on which you can check a box showing that you choose not to disclose anything at all. The other one is Ban Ki-moon's statement, which consists of 18 words, 9 of which are Republic of Korea with no price at all. That's public disclosure. And I would finally recommend that if there is to be a debate over withholding funds from the United Nations as a way of imposing leverage, it would be very useful to keep in mind that this is an institution which years ago began to regard $1 billion as a rounding error. Thank you very much, and I would be happy to answer your questions.
Thank you very much. Before going to Mr. Newer, I just want to note that Walker Roberts is here. We have a number of former staffers who was a top staffer under Chairman Henry Hyde, and Mark Tavlarides, who was Chief of Staff for the Human Rights Committee back in the 1980s, and I'm sure there's a few others, Mr. Chairman.
They're all here.
Rio, of course.
They're all here to hear Peter.
Exactly. Peter, we'll go to Mr. Newer now.
Distinguished members of the committee, thank you for inviting me here today. The urgent problem that I wish to address concerns the state of human rights at the United Nations. The UN Human Rights Council this year undergoes a review of its first 5 years of work. How has it performed? Let's first recall the history. In 2005, then UN Secretary General Kofi Annan called to scrap the old Human Rights Commission. He explained why. Countries had joined, quote, not to strengthen human rights, but to protect themselves against criticism or to criticize others. The Commission was plagued by politicization and selectivity. It suffered from declining professionalism and a credibility deficit, which, quote, cast a shadow upon the reputation of the UN system as a whole. To remedy these fatal flaws, the UN created the Council 1 year later. The 2006 resolution promised a membership committed to human rights that would respond to severe abuses, including by urgent sessions. Its work would be impartial and non-selective. Today, 5 years later, we ask, has the Council redressed the shortcomings of its predecessor? Has it lived up to its promise? Let us consider first the Council's current members. They include Bangladesh, China, Cuba, Pakistan, Russia, and Saudi Arabia. The newest member is Libya, under the dictatorship of Colonel Gaddafi. As measured by Freedom House, 57% of the members fail to meet basic democracy standards. Mr. Chairman, imagine a jury that includes murderers and rapists, or a police force run in large part by suspected murderers and rapists who are determined to stymie investigation of their crimes. That was said by Kenneth Roth of Human Rights Watch in 2001, but the analogy applies even more today. Second, let's look at the Council's response over the past 5 years to the world's worst human rights violations. Here's what we find. For the 1/5 of the world's population living in China, where millions have suffered gross and systematic repression, for the minority Uyghurs who have been massacred, the Tibetans killed, the Council adopted not a single resolution. Its response was silence. For the peaceful civic activists, bloggers, and dissidents in Cuba who are beaten or languish in prison, no resolutions. For the victims of Iran, massacred by their own government while the Human Rights Council was actually in session, subjected to torture, rape, and execution, no action. For the women of Saudi Arabia subjugated, the rape victims sentenced to lashes, the Council looked away. For the people of Zimbabwe, who suffer under the jackboot of the Mugabe regime, no resolutions. Mr. Chairman, apart from a handful of exceptions, the UN Human Rights Council, in the 5 years of its existence, has systematically turned a blind eye to the world's worst abuses and has failed the victims most in need. You may ask then, what does it do with its time? I will tell you. To an astonishing degree, the Council has reserved its moral outrage for demonizing one single country, Israel, the only liberal democracy in the Middle East. Consider, 1. In total, the Council has adopted some 50 resolutions condemning countries. Of these, 35 have been on Israel, i.e. 70%. All have been one-sided condemnations that grant impunity to Hamas and Hezbollah terror and to their state sponsor, the Islamic Republic of Iran. 2, built into the Council's permanent agenda as a special item on Israel, no other country is singled out in this fashion. 3, the Council's machinery of fact-finding missions exists almost solely to attack Israel. The most notorious example is the Goldstone Report, a travesty of justice that excoriated Israel and exonerated Hamas. This was not surprising, given that the mission operated according to a prejudicial mandate, a predetermined verdict, and with members like Christine Chinkin, who declared Israel guilty in advance. 4, out of 10 special sessions that criticized countries, 6 were on Israel, 4 for the rest of the world combined. 5, The Council has a permanent investigator, Richard Falk, mandated solely to report on, quote, Israel's violations of the principles of international law. Mr. Falk also happens to be one of the leading proponents in this country of the conspiracy theory that the 9/11 terrorist attacks were an inside job orchestrated by the U.S. government. Now, in response to our protest last week, I'm pleased to report that yesterday the Secretary General sent me a letter stating that he condemns the preposterous remarks of Mr. Falk and regards them as an affront to the memory of the 3,000 victims that perished that day. We call on Mr. Ban Ki-moon to take action to remove Mr. Falk immediately. Mr. Chairman, the promises of the Council's founding resolution, improved membership, action for victims, an end to politicization and selectivity, have not been kept. On the contrary, if we consider the fatal flaws identified by Kofi Annan in the old Commission, every single one applies equally today to the new Council. Thank you.
Mr. Noor, thank you very much for your testimony, and having worked with you, thank you for your leadership at the UN. I'd like to now recognize Mr. Yo.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member Berman for inviting me to appear before the committee today. Right now, across the globe, the UN stands by America as we struggle for democracy, human rights, and world prosperity. We need the UN to run smoothly because we have a stake in where the UN is headed. We need the UN to continue, even hurry on its current course, straight towards a more stable and prosperous world that serves America's strategic, economic, humanitarian, and political interests. As we meet here today, votes in Sudan are being counted to determine whether South Sudan should secede. America has strongly backed this process with enormous diplomatic and financial contribution, and in that we are joined by the United Nations, which has allocated money and more than 10,000 UN workers, peacekeepers, and volunteers to support the referendum. In Cote d'Ivoire, where the U.S. has long sought peace and stability, the entire UN system holds fast for democracy and against genocide. The Security Council has called on the nation's defeated president to recognize the results of the referendum, and UN peacekeepers now stand as the sole line of protection for Cote d'Ivoire's democratically elected president. The UN has partnered with America to battle the nuclear threat Iran poses. Just last summer, the UN Security Council imposed its toughest ever sanctions on Iran. Defense Secretary Gates heaped praise on the UN resolution, and EU and others have joined America in putting in place tough sanctions that are having an economic impact on the Iranian government. In Afghanistan, the UN has joined American forces to promote security and battle the rise of extremist forces. The UN provided support for Afghanistan's independent electoral authorities and has facilitated the removal of landmines and weapons, making Afghanistan safer for civilians and American forces. And not far from our shores, the UN battles mightily to stabilize and reconstruct earthquake-shattered Haiti, a country with close ties to America. UN peacekeepers patrol the streets, provide security to many displaced Haitians, train Haitian police, and feed nearly 2 million Haitians a day. And right here at home, the UN is promoting American economic interests and creating jobs. For every dollar invested by the U.S. in the UN, American firms receive approximately $1.50 in UN contracts and other benefits. As we've heard from the witnesses who preceded me, the UN is not a perfect institution, but it serves a near-perfect purpose to bolster American interests from Africa to the Western Hemisphere and to allow our nation to share the burden of promoting international peace and stability. The UN now has greatly improved its ability to identify and correct waste, fraud, and abuse. The General Assembly created the Independent Audit Advisory Committee, a move recommended by the Gingrich-Mitchell UN Task Force, and which is now headed by David Walker, the former U.S. Comptroller and head of GAO. The Secretary General recently appointed a Canadian with decades of auditing and oversight experience as Undersecretary General for Internal Oversight Services. The UN has also moved aggressively to strengthen its ethical culture. A new UN ethics office is in place, and all UN funds and programs created individual ethics offices or agreed to use the Secretariat's ethics office. Led by a U.S. attorney, the UN ethics office oversees the new financial disclosure statements required by UN employees above a certain level and with fiduciary responsibilities. Since 2007, the UN has mandated ethics and integrity training for all UN staff members. Over the past 2 years, the UN has also taken significant steps to ensure that the most productive and effective workforce possible. The UN created a professional and independent system made up of 15 judges to address employment issues. The U.S. decision to join the Human Rights Council has also produced tangible results. The U.S. led 55 other countries in a successful effort to criticize Iran for its human rights violations. Effective U.S. diplomacy has also improved the Council's ability to address specific countries of concern. Nevertheless, some of the most challenging and serious human rights violations continue to go unaddressed, and the Council itself places undue focus on Israel. As with any public institution, fine-tuning the operation is a continual process, but the UN is a very different institution today than it was just 5 or 6 years ago. The UN has implemented most of the reform recommendations made by the congressionally mandated task force on the UN and by Paul Volcker's Independent Investigation Commission. But further progress will not happen unless the U.S. is at the table pressing for changes. And that means that we must pay our dues to the UN on time and in full without threats of withholding our contribution. When we act otherwise, we send a strong and provocative signal that we are more interested in tearing the UN down than making it better, and going it alone rather than working with all sides. Over the last few years, as Congress has paid our dues without drama and delay, we have been able to work well with the UN to move forward on many important management changes. And polls tell us that cooperation is what the American people want. And bipartisan research released by BWC this October, 63% of Americans support payment of U.S. dues to the UN on time and in full, and 70% felt the same way about UN peacekeeping dues. But in the end, we need to pay our UN dues, not just because it's popular, but because it's necessary to maintain a healthy UN ready to stand by America and our deep and abiding interest in peace, stability, and democracy around the world. Thank you.
Mr. Yeo, thank you very much. Mr. Quarterman.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Berman, distinguished members of the committee, I'm honored to have been invited to appear before you today. As a result of my service with the United Nations, I'm well aware of the organization's strengths and weaknesses, as well as of its vital role in the world. The UN makes real contributions to the global good on a daily basis and is often the first responder in times of natural or man-made disaster. The World Food Program feeds 90 million people in 73 countries. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights supports 34 million people forcibly displaced. UNICEF provides immunizations to more than half of the world's children. Peacekeeping has often been referred to as a force multiplier for the U.S., but I believe that in a broader sense, the UN is an influence multiplier for the U.S. as well, and it plays this role in 3 ways. First, the UN operates in places where the U.S. might have concerns but not fundamental interests. An example includes Sudan, where the UN helped to keep the peace and played a central role in the recent successful referendum. This provides for burden and cost sharing. It allows U.S. interests to be addressed without U.S. troops being deployed. Second, the UN talks to people and parties the U.S. will not or cannot talk to. In Sudan, for example, along with the African Union, the UN has directly applied pressure on the regime in Khartoum to allow the referendum to go forward. Third, the UN's legitimacy and credibility around the world enables it to carry out tasks that governments alone are not able to do. Thus, the Pakistani government asked the United Nations to undertake an inquiry into the assassination of Benazir Bhutto, their former prime minister, which was my last job at the United Nations and something I was honored to do. The U.S. remains the most influential member of the UN, and it does more to set the agenda of the organization than any other nation. Examples of the U.S. being outvoted in the UN come largely from the General Assembly, where the principle of one member, one vote pertains, but where resolutions are not binding on member states. However, the U.S. has a significant and powerful voice in the Security Council, in part because of its status as a permanent member with a veto, and in part because of the initiative that America traditionally and consistently takes in the Council. For example, the last 2 years of the Bush administration was among the most active and productive periods for the Security Council and resulted in groundbreaking resolutions. An emblematic earlier example of U.S. leadership is the skillful diplomacy deployed by the administration of George H.W. Bush in response to the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. A more recent example of leadership in the Council was the Obama administration's successful effort to place serious sanctions on Iran. U.S. leadership and influence in the UN results in part from its status as the largest contributor to the organization. We must not return to the days of withholding funds, as some have suggested. Withholding funds hurts the UN and doesn't advance U.S. interest. This does not mean that the U.S. should not take a close look at management and budget issues in the UN. Congress and the executive branch must ensure that America's contributions, which are substantial, are used effectively, efficiently, and for the purposes intended and approved. It's necessary for the U.S. to be actively engaged to exercise its influence in the UN fully. The Human Rights Council is a good example of this. There should be no doubt that the Human Rights Council needs reform. Reasonable people can disagree about whether the U.S. should engage or stay out. However, only by being at the table can the U.S. bring about the changes necessary to assist it to evolve into a more credible vehicle to protect and promote human rights around the world. No one is fully satisfied with multilateralism. Having worked in the UN, I saw that firsthand and felt that. It's hard. Multilateralism is very hard, and we use it to tackle the toughest issues of the global commons, most of which touch on fundamental national interests of many countries. It requires bargaining, negotiation, and compromise. And it requires that in a way that's not unlike the legislative process we see in this venerable institution. While most of us are dissatisfied, we have to realize that there is no effective alternative method of dealing with transnational problems that do not respect borders and that have the potential of significantly affecting our lives. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Berman, distinguished members of the committee, as I stated at the outset, and as has been stated, I served with the UN for 12 years. I served because of the organization's ideals, and I am proud that they were profoundly shaped and influenced by American ideals. I have friends and close colleagues at the UN who died in the line of duty in furtherance of the aims of the UN Charter for the global good. I honor them for their service and am honored by my time in service at the UN. I believe in the United Nations, and I want us to work together to help the UN to live up to its ideals. Thank you.
Thank you, and now we will hear from Mr. Appleton.
Thank you. I would like to thank the committee for the invitation to appear here today. I'm deeply honored for the opportunity. From 2006 to 2008, I served as the head of the United Nations Procurement Task Force, or PTF, a special independent anti-corruption investigations unit in the UN created in the wake of the oil for food scandal with the responsibility to investigate fraud and corruption in the operations of the UN Secretariat throughout the world, which included all of its peacekeeping missions and overseas offices. I reported to the Undersecretary General of OIOS. The PTF was temporary, formed for a specific purpose, and depended upon the UN General Assembly for its funding. Over 3 years, this 26-person investigation unit, comprised of lawyers, former prosecutors, white-collar fraud specialists, and forensic accountants from 14 countries, under my direction, conducted hundreds of corruption investigations, issued 36 major reports, complete with findings, conclusions, and an aggregate total of 187 recommendations, which included referrals to national authorities for prosecution, legal advice and proposals based on our previous experience to recover losses and damages, and recommendations to pursue misconduct charges against staff that violated the rules and regulations of the organization or committed fraud or corruption. Through these investigations, we identified at least 20 major fraud schemes, hundreds of millions in losses and waste, and more than $1 billion in tainted contracts. 47 contractors were debarred for corruption, and the PTF marked the first time within the UN that the external investigations of those conducting business with the UN were properly and thoroughly investigated. A vendor sanctions panel and framework began to function and worked well. In those cases in which the PTF found fraud or other illegality, the results were largely substantiated by national courts. In an audit that was conducted of the PTF's operations in 2008 by the UN Board of Auditors, found our methods appropriate, staff well qualified, and its existence served as a deterrent to fraud and corruption. A number of prosecutions by national authorities resulted from or were supported by the PTF, although as explained herein, many more could have been pursued. Nevertheless, much success was achieved despite the impediments. One of our most significant cases in the Southern District of New York, a senior procurement official and an agent of a large UN vendor were convicted after a 2-month trial of engaging in a $100 million fraud, collusion, and bribery scheme with a connection with a series of UN contracts. The procurement official was subsequently sentenced to 8.5 years imprisonment, and the evidence for this case was principally gathered by the PTF and contained in its report. However, despite the confirmation of the accuracy of the findings of the PTF in many cases, most unfortunately, the efforts of the PTF were opposed by certain member state delegations who came to the defense of either citizens or officials who were nationals or their companies or citizens. The UN administration accepted the PTF but showed lethargy in moving forward on many of its recommendations to pursue matters in civil courts or charging wrongdoers with misconduct. Prior to the expiration of the PTF at the end of 2008, the General Assembly, at the forceful behest of a member state that opposed their efforts, commissioned the audit of the PTF, which ultimately found that we were compliant with UN rules, regulations, and standards that did not selectively target individuals, regions, or countries, and the staff was well qualified. The hostility to the unique status and independence of the PTF from member states that opposed its investigations finally led to the PTF's demise. In 2008, those member states were able to successfully block further funding by the unit, and the PTF was forced to close. Despite an admonition that the expertise and staff were to be incorporated into the OIOS, that did not happen. Despite this, the efforts did not diminish, and the professional of the staff to accomplish as much as possible did not wane. In the final months of the PTF's tenure, we completed 5 major corruption reports that identified significant fraud and corruption, including a report on fraud in Iraq, significant and pervasive fraud in elections, road and rebuilding in Afghanistan, fraud and corruption in the Economic Commission of Africa, and several matters involving high-value contacts in transportation in Africa. Despite that, I am, as far as I'm aware, and despite the recommendations, significant follow-up has only been made in one case. The vision of the Undersecretary General at the time for a financial crimes unit has been scuttled in place of a nondescript unit simply known as Unit 5, which until recently had but a few investigators and none with serious white-collar fraud experience. At one time, investigators were informed that they were not going to investigate parties external to the organization, including tens of thousands of contractors that do business with the organization. Even worse, the former PTF investigators were subject to harassment and retaliation. Some were even the subject of investigations themselves for wholly spurious reasons, and when they were cleared by independent entities, no public mention was made of this fact. In short, all the achievements and advancements that were made by the PTF have since lapsed following its conclusion. And the stark reality is that the ills that the UN experienced in the wake of the oil for food scandal are now distant memories in the halls of UN buildings, and unless serious action takes place, there is no question history will repeat itself. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And before I give myself my allotted 5 minutes, I think Mr. Bierman wants to make a statement regarding his committee side.
Well, thank you very much. Simply to point out that this is a briefing, not a hearing, because the committee has not yet formally organized. Both sides have a number of new members, and it's my intention to wait until that organizational meeting to introduce our side of the new members group. We're glad to have all these members, but we'll wait till the organizational meeting, which, as I understand it, now will not occur until after we come back from the recess in 2 weeks.
I think you wanted to get that piece of housekeeping out of the way. Okay, I'm going to budget myself 5 minutes, which means I'd like your answers to be very short and very concise. Mr. Yo and Mr. Quarterman, you have talked about how important it is for the U.S. to pay our assessed dues in full, but you've worked in Congress and you know the biggest leverage we have over the executive branch is the power of the purse. After past history contradicts your arguments, like the 1990s when we got substantial reform through the Helms-Biden agreement, which conditioned payment on past dues on specific key reforms. But I'd like to ask all of the briefers, if the UN agencies and other member states know that we're going to pay our assessed contributions in full, no matter what, why on earth would they agree to real reforms? And the second part, so doesn't simple facts and logic call precisely for using our contributions as leverage and not just as paying our dues in full? I'm going to give you about 20 seconds each to answer that, Mr. Schaefer.
Well, the short answer is that the UN organizations regard U.S. assessments as an entitlement. They don't think that the U.S. should use those assessments as leverage, and they resist reform in general. As I mentioned in my oral statement, the UN is nothing but patient. It is willing to outlast and wait for certain individuals to turn their attention to other matters, and you have to tie financial leverage if you want to get the UN's attention. I mentioned a number of specific reforms in my written statement. I'd like it submitted for the record if I could.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Mrs. Rosette?
There are two levers I have seen have any effect: shame and money. Money is far more powerful. The two are linked, and the thing that I think does matter and should be one of the main focuses right away is we endlessly talk about transparency at the UN. It is an endless game in which it is promised, and again, I refer you to that financial disclosure form where they disclose nothing. And this is, the Secretary General boasts about it. There are things, especially in the digital age, that are both important for security reasons, important for information, and important for any reform. There should be enormous pressure for the UN to actually produce intelligible, consolidated databases. If you ask everyone in this room, what is the UN system-wide budget, you will get answers where actually the rounding errors are 5 billion. That's strange. That needs remedying.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Newer?
Well, we've always supported the U.S. paying its fair share of the dues. There's no question that UN agencies that are voluntary are known, and U.S. diplomats will tell you, to be far more accountable and to operate better. It's something that we see in Geneva regularly. In addition, there are, of course, UN agencies such as the Division on Palestinian Affairs, which gets some $5–6 million every biennial budget that clearly ought to be defunded.
Mr. Yo.
Over the past 5 to 6 years, you've seen concrete changes in the way the UN is run, whether it's in terms of ethics, oversight, personnel, all of which have occurred without any legislative threat between dues and reform. So we do not need the threat of withholding dues to actually make something happen at the UN to make it a more efficient institution. Second of all, 70% of all of Americans' assessed contributions to the UN each year are for UN peacekeeping. As a permanent member of the Security Council, we must actively support the creation and the change of any UN peacekeeping mission. So we already have more power than 187 other states at the UN that do not have the veto.
Thank you. Mr. Quarterman?
Thank you very much. The U.S. has multiple needs at the UN. It needs, of course, to oversee the use of its funds, to make sure that those funds are used effectively, to make sure the UN is run effectively. It also has diplomatic needs. The United Nations, as Mr. Yo pointed out, puts peacekeeping missions in the field, carries out a variety of other tasks as well. The U.S. has substantial influence over the shape and organization and deployment of peacekeeping missions. But it needs I've seen that U.S. influence has lessened when the U.S. has not contributed and the diplomatic atmosphere is less positive.
Thank you. Mr. Appleton?
Thanks. Very briefly, it's the only legitimate and real tool that can be used, and it's what most officials inside the UN Secretariat are most fearful of. And the irony is that the fear of bad news is, and its possible effect on donations is the reason why the organization is not transparent. Thank you.
Thank you. And in keeping with my policy of a firm 5 minutes, I've got 17 seconds left, so I'm going to yield back my balance and give Mr. Bierman his 5 minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Chairwoman, and I thank all of you for coming and for your excellent testimony. Much of it, I found a great deal of it very interesting and educational. Mr. Schaefer touches on an issue that I think we have to cope with, the notion that 128 of the member countries pay about 1% of the total UN regular budget and can drive in a non-consensus budget process. The thing is something that I think we do have to come to grips with. But Mr. Yo's recent comment, his comment he just made, that 70% of American expenditures that are assessed go to the peacekeeping where no peacekeeping operation occurs if the U.S. doesn't want it to occur, because those are ordered by the Security Council and we have a veto there, adds a little context to what you were saying, Mr. Schaefer. I also find your testimony useful in that it told me things I had no idea that there were these regional commissions drawing and expending apparently significant sums of money and work that I have no idea what they do, and I've never heard anything about them before. So I thank you for that. But I'd like to ask a couple of, well, and the other thing I might note, though, is if I listen to the harshest critics on this panel regarding the UN, apparently nothing that the UN does do they find to be positive. It did seem to be the glass is completely empty sort of position. Mr. Noor, I'd like to ask you a couple of questions. Do you agree with the opening statement, essentially, that the United States should not have joined the Human Rights Council? That's sort of a yes or no question.
Thank you. We welcomed the U.S. joining, provided that they would do certain things.
Do you think that the U.S. should get off that council right now?
No, we have not taken that position, and we continue to urge the U.S. to do the things necessary.
Do you think the United States should withhold the amount of dues that one assumes is being spent by the Human Rights Council, our proportionate share of that dues?
It's not something we've taken a position on.
You're not advocating that?
We haven't taken a position on it at this time.
Okay. Do you think the U.S. role has produced some useful changes at the Human Rights Council?
Yes, there have been some changes in tone. One of them is described in my prepared testimony regarding, for example, defending the rights of NGOs. And of course, the U.S. has stood with Israel. One example is something that happened today regarding the regional groups, where the Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon, was addressing an assembly in Geneva of all member states, and Israel being excluded from any of the regional groups in Geneva. While it is a member of the Western group in New York, it is excluded in Geneva. It was not represented when those 5 groups made their statements. The United States mission stood for principle, stood with Israel in dissociating itself from the Western group statement because Israel was excluded and discriminated against in that fashion. And that's, of course, something that ought to be saluted.
And in fact, if you don't mind, I'd like to quote in my remaining time that part of your prepared testimony that you weren't able to give because you summed it up. The Council's abysmal record, and I'm quoting you, comes in spite of the determined efforts of a few stakeholders. In this regard, we commend the dedicated work of the U.S. delegation in Geneva. We've had the privilege to interact with Ambassador King, Ambassador Donahoe, and their colleagues, and we greatly appreciate their leadership and support. When UN Watch brought victims of Libyan torture to testify before the Council, a string of repressive regimes interrupted and sought to silence them. The U.S. delegation spoke out and successfully defended the victim's right to speak. We equally appreciate the important work of Ambassador Barton and his colleagues at ECOSOC in defending the rights of NGOs, of which your organization is one. I appreciate you sharing this information, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you to my good colleague from California. Now I'd like to turn it over to my good colleague from New Jersey, Mr. Smith, Subcommittee Chairman on Africa, Global Health, and Human Rights.
I thank my good friend, the distinguished chair from Ohio, for yielding. And welcome to the panelists. Thank you for your testimony. You know, last week, Hu Jintao evaded any meaningful accountability for presiding over some of the most egregious human rights abuses and violations in the world. By Friday, the press in China, and I read much of the press, were calling it a masterstroke of diplomacy. At a press conference on Thursday, President Obama offered what the Washington Post called, in its editorial, President Obama makes Hu Jintao look good on rights, excuses for Chinese human rights violations. He said China has a different culture. Yeah, it has a different culture, a wonderful culture. The people of China, as expressed in Charter 08, desperately want human rights to be protected, and tens of thousands of people languish in the Laogai simply because they want democracy and human rights protected, including Liu Xiaobo, the 2010 Nobel Peace Prize winner. The president said they have a different political system. Yeah, it's a dictatorship, and they rule by guns and force and torture. So those excuses were at best lame, and I think they were very, very enabling, and press in China clearly shows that. But for the UN's part, frankly, they have failed repeatedly. The Human Rights Council, CEDAW, the treaty body, which should have and continues to not hold China accountable, The Convention on the Rights of the Child, treaty body, has failed to hold them to account. In instance after instance, China, except for people like Manfred Nowak, who did a great piece on torture in China, it is largely just brushed aside, and the world community looks askance at China's egregious violations of human rights. Nowhere is this more egregious, in my view, than in the 30-year program known as the one-child-per-couple policy, where brothers and sisters are illegal, where forced abortion is pervasive. It is every woman's story to be coerced into having an abortion or an involuntary sterilization. I met with Pang Pei-yung, a woman who ran the program in the 1990s, and all she kept telling me was that the UNFPA is here and they see no coercion. Last week, Speaker Boehner asked Hu Jintao whether or not, about forced abortion, and what did Hu Jintao said? There's no forced abortions in China. When you deny, and lie and deceive as they do, and that's enabled by the UNFPA, which has a program there and trains family planning cadres, that makes the UNFPA complicit in these crimes against women and crimes against humanity. Let me just mention a few final points, and Mr. Yu, you might want to speak to this. Ted Turner in December at the Cancun meeting on global climate change said that the UN or the world needs a one-child-per-couple policy. Again, brothers and sisters are illegal in China. The only way you enforce it is with coercion, heavy fines, and of course this crime against humanity, which the Nazis were held to account for at the Nuremberg War Crimes Tribunal as a crime against humanity because they practiced forced abortion against Polish women. Ted Turner said we need one-child-per-couple policy. Upon questioning, he said, but I don't really know the intricacies as to how it is implemented. Are you kidding? Mr. Yo, you might want to speak to that. I have held 27 hearings on human rights abuse in China alone, most of those with a heavy emphasis on this terrible attack against women. This is the worst human rights violation of women's rights ever, and we have been largely silent. The UN has been totally silent. Beyond that, they've been complicit. So if you could speak to that, and Mr. Yo, you might want to speak to it first.
Sure. Thank you, Congressman, first of all, for your passionate interest in the issue, this issue. You and I completely agree that coercive abortion, coercive family planning, and forced sterilization is absolutely outrageous, has no place in any type of family planning programs anywhere in the world. So we 100% agree on this. Let me make two comments. First of all, in the context of UNFPA's work in China, they have repeatedly indicated to the Chinese that they oppose the coercive nature of the one-child policy. And in the counties in which UNFPA was operating under its previous plan, the abortion rate went down, the forced sterilization rate went down, and the rate at which people had access to voluntary family planning went up. What's happening now in the context of China is UNFPA is working directly with the Chinese government to continue to emphasize the voluntary nature of their program.
We're almost out of time.
Okay,
but let me say very briefly, that is contested. And let me also say for everyone, we need to be considering the missing girls. Chai Ling, the great leader of the Tiananmen Square activist movement, who thankfully got out of China, she's running a group called All Girls Allowed, trying to raise the issue of the missing girls. 100 million is one estimate, with the disproportionality between males and females completely attributable to the one-child-per-couple policy. Terrible, terrible crime of gender.
Thank you very much to my good friend New Jersey and to my other good friend from New Jersey. Is this a New Jersey thing going on here?
Jersey.
Mr. Sires, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. You know, for all the positive and the strengths of the UN, I think it's overshadowed by its weaknesses. And I'm not there yet of reducing money for the UN, but I tell you, I'm getting very close. As I look at this Human Rights Council, you know, I'm a Cuban American. I lived in Cuba till I was 11 years old. I saw Che Guevara set up the firing squads. I see what's going on with the prisoners in jail. I saw Orlando Zapata die, and, you know, I read all about it. I read what they do to the women in white. I see what they do with Israel. I see that we have Alan Gross in jail for over a year. And the resolutions don't seem to come up. And what is the answer to a reform? What do? They elect the ambassador from Cuba as vice president of the council. My friends, it's not that we need reform. It is broken. You should throw it in the East River, the whole committee. I mean, it is shameful that you have a Human Rights Commission that elects these people, and all they do is beat up on the only democracy that we have and make a mockery of the human rights conditions in Cuba. So when you talk about reform, I mean, it's just so dysfunctional. It is just so shameful. I don't even know how they can sit in a committee and how the vice president talk about human rights. So, and then obviously they crank up the propaganda machine. 128 countries, on any resolution, they vote against the interests of the United States all the time. So, I guess I am frustrated, as my colleague from New Jersey is. It's turned into a tool to beat up on this country. It's turned into a tool to protect themselves from criticism on human rights. So how do you reform it? Can anybody tell me, other than, and I'm not advocating taking the money away, but I tell you, I'm getting very close. Peter, my friend?
Thank you for your question. Obviously, Cuba's human rights record couldn't agree with you more in terms of how abysmal it is. I would just note, though, that since the U.S. has rejoined the Council, Cuban influence over certain decisions has decreased significantly. And in fact, Cuba opposed the creation of a special rapporteur in terms of freedom of assembly and was overruled on that move. And second of all, since the U.S. has rejoined the Council itself has spoken out for important human rights issues around the world, has done so even over Cuban objections and the objections of other countries. By being at the table, the U.S. can stand up for our allies, can stand up for human rights. If we're not there, our voice goes away. And so the U.S. has an imperative to use the Human Rights Council as a way for us to stand up for human rights and for us to stand up for democracy.
Mr. Schaefer, would you comment on that?
The Council hasn't passed a resolution on Cuba.
I've been in this country 48 years. Yeah. I never heard a resolution yet.
The human rights advocates that go before the Council are repeatedly abused and interrupted, and an attempt at intimidating them from speaking freely is made by Cuba and its allies on the Council. The Council's broken, and a big part of the problem is the membership. The membership needs to change. There is a review that is mandatory this year for considering reforms to the Council to try and improve it. And there needs to be serious membership criteria to keep countries like Cuba from getting on the Council and influencing unduly its agenda.
How do you do that when they have so much influence on some of these other countries? How do you keep these people away from this committee?
Well, one way to do it is to force regional groups to offer competitive slates. I'm not saying that Cuba wouldn't get elected, but if there is actually a competitive election, the chances of Cuba getting elected are diminished. In other countries with reprehensible human rights records as well.
This is an election that got elected the ambassador to the vice president. This reminds me of elections in Cuba. Castro gets for 98% of the votes. But nobody else
when
runs.
You take a look at the elections they have, most regional groups offer clean slates, meaning the only number of candidates that are open slots on the Council are put forward. And so essentially it's a rigged election. You need to have competition so that viable candidates with better human rights records are on the ballot, and hopefully they will draw more support. Another thing that needs to be done is the Human Rights Council is funded through the UN regular budget, so it's assessed contribution. The U.S. can symbolically withhold the U.S. proportional amount of that, but it gets spread throughout the UN regular budget, and so the Council never really feels it. We need to spin those types of activities out of the UN regular budget so that if Congress is upset with the conduct of the Council or its actions, it can directly target the Council itself for the financial leverage that it has available to it.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. And now I will turn to my good friend from California on the Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations, the chairman. It's your turn, sir.
Thank you very much. I've been trying to get a handle on how much money we're talking about, and one of you referenced that it was, when you take a look at the overall picture and the very different things that we're talking about as part of the UN, that it was close to $5 billion. What are we talking about here? how much are we spending for the United, or how much is the budget of all of these UN? Thanks. Yes.
Congressman, that's an excellent question, and to be honest with you, nobody really had an answer until fairly recently. Congress actually mandated that OMB consolidate all of the monies that the U.S. gives to the United Nations organizations in general, and the first report on that was produced by OMB in 2005. The most recent report by OMB said that the U.S. gave total $6.3+ billion to the United Nations system in 2009. The legislation mandating that report be...
Excuse me, was that what the United States gave, or is that the budget for all of it?
No, that's what the United States gave in 2009. The best estimate I've seen for the entire UN system, including regular budget and extra budgetary figures, was $36 billion, and that was produced in a UN report in 2009.
Okay, and anyone else on the panel have more to add to that?
I would just add that in terms of U.S. contributions, the 2.1 that is sent every year in terms of our assessed contributions to peacekeeping is all done with American approval through the concept of the Security Council.
Yes, through the Security Council, which also we might add, China has a veto over anything that can be done from the Security Council. So let's add that to America's approval. Yes, ma'am?
The answer is actually nobody knows. If you call the Secretariat, which I do periodically, and ask them what is the UN system-wide budget, the answer is they do not even systematically keep track. And different agencies take in different amounts. The OMB figures are missing some items. So even the U.S. $6.3 billion answer isn't obvious.
All right.
The UN has gone in for public-private partnerships, trust funds. That's why I'm saying what is needed is a consolidated, clear database that really tells you not just what they're budgeting, but what they're spending. Because right now, some years ago, former Chairman Henry Hyde said he could not get a handle on the total budget.
Okay, let's just note that the chairman of this committee told us earlier, Mr. Berman, that he didn't even know about these regional UN operations, and he's chairman of this Foreign Affairs Committee, for Pete's sakes. I would say that we've got some work to do if we're going to be representing the interests of the American people. So maybe $6.3 billion, maybe more. How much out of a possible $36 billion budget? How much of that of $36 billion is China paying? Yes, ma'am.
They pay about 1/10 of the assessed dues. For the rest, again, we simply don't know. There is, if you ask for a consolidated statement, you can't get it. Each agency is supposed to keep track in itself. The agencies are opaque.
Okay.
There's no way to know.
Okay, let me just note with the answers that we just got, there is a global fund that fights AIDS, for example, and the United States has spent in the last 8 years $4.3 billion. This isn't a UN agency. That's not even included in the $36 billion. So we spent $4.3 billion. That's 28% of all the contributions, similar to what we're doing. Yet China has given $16 million to the fund. Let us note, for just that fund, China has received $1 billion while contributing $16 million. And let me just note that they've only had 38 cases a year of malaria and AIDS, or malaria, which is the malaria monies that we're talking about, that while the Congo has massive death from malaria, it received just $149 million to combat malaria is what China received, and the Congo, which has a massive problem, received $122 million. So in other words, you've got this big country, China, who is not contributing very much and receiving great benefits from these UN programs. We can't put up with that. This is absurd. When we have a $1.5 trillion deficit in this country, we're not going to put up with this anymore. What we're doing is loaning. We're taking loans from China in order to give to UN programs that then are being ripped off by China. This has got to stop, and I would say, Madam Chairman, that the UN should be one of our prime targets for reducing expenditures in order to bring down this deficit in our next few years. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And now I'd like to turn this over to Mr. Ted Deutsch from Florida.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to follow up on where the ranking member left off. That is the Human Rights Council and the U.S. role. The U.S., on the positive note, the U.S. helped block Iran's membership on the Human Rights Council. The U.S. helped mobilize the statement condemning repression in Iran. But I'd like to understand process a little bit. How is it that of the 50 resolutions, Mr. Nord, the condemned countries, 35 condemned Israel, where do they originate? And ultimately, I'd like to talk about how we reform that. But if you could speak to that, please.
Sure, thank you. The resolutions, the 35 on Israel, for example, are all, as far as I can recall, introduced by the Islamic group and the Arab group at the Human Rights Council. They control an automatic majority. Out of 47 member states, approximately 30 will approve anything that is introduced by these groups. The resolution could propose that the earth is flat, and that resolution would be adopted by 30 votes out of 47. So the moment anything happens in the Middle East or doesn't happen, these resolutions are being introduced and adopted automatically. And that's the problem. There's an automatic majority that is dominated by repressive regimes. There are countries who vote for them that are not repressive regimes. Countries like India, that is a democracy, for example, or South Africa. Regrettably, they continue to vote along dynamics that are either consistent with the non-aligned movement, the anti-colonial, anti-Western ideologies. And so we have this majority. And the question is, how can we stop it? And the answer in the near term is that we cannot stop these resolutions. And it is almost impossible to adopt a resolution. As we heard before, the situation in Cuba, and our organization, UN Watch, has worked with victims from Cuba, like Nestor Rodriguez Lubaina, who's been beaten up and was denied permission to attend a human rights summit that we organized last year. It's impossible to pass a resolution on these situations. However, and this is a critical point, we spoke here today about the power of the purse. Well, at the UN, that resides in New York in the General Assembly. In Geneva, the Human Rights Council has the power of shame. It is very significant. It is the power to turn an international spotlight on some of the worst abuses of the world that would otherwise go hidden, and to help victims who have no independent voice, not freedom of the press or a free parliament or a free judiciary. And what we have not seen is a determined effort by the democracies, the United States, the European Union, and others, to introduce resolutions, even if we know they're going to fail. And being in the opposition, as members here will know, has a lot of tools. And what we want to see is resolutions introduced on Iran, on Cuba, on China, on Zimbabwe. Even if they fail, the attention, the diplomatic energy and commotion that is generated would have, in our view, the same effect and would take the offensive and put the worst abusers on the defense.
Is there some history of that? Are there resolutions that have been proposed and rejected that would further our human rights agenda?
And not at the Human Rights Council, but previously at the Human Rights Commission under the Bush administration, this did happen. There were resolutions introduced on China, on Zimbabwe that failed, and in our view, had a positive effect.
And I have a short time left. Mr. Schaefer, you talked about membership standards. I'm intrigued. I think that would permit us to have a frank discussion about the nature of the nations that are making determinations about human rights standards throughout the world. Can you elaborate a bit?
Sure. The council, or the resolution that created the UN Human Rights Council, said that countries have to submit a declaration of their dedication to human rights. So you have this farcical process wherein China or Iran submit their human rights bona fides to the United Nations General Assembly, saying why they deserve to be elected to the UN Human Rights Council. No one pays attention to it. I think that there needs to be an outside evaluation of that, perhaps by NGOs, Freedom House, some other organizations could take a look at that and give an assessment of an objective assessment of the actual grades, and hopefully that could influence the process. Perhaps if you move away from a secret ballot to a recorded vote on some of these things, you may actually see some changes in votes. But the key thing, I think, is moving to a competitive election rather than a clean slate election wherein countries are just locked into a seat.
And I only have a few seconds. Could you speak, though, to the credentials that China, for example, would have put forth to justify its membership?
It said that it had freedom of assembly. It said it had a democracy. It said that it respected the freedom of the press. I mean, you can go through
Iran as well?
Iran as well, across the board. These countries basically say that they espouse the fundamental freedoms endorsed in the UN Charter and in the Universal Declaration, because that is the criteria under which you're supposed to meet in terms of being eligible for a council seat.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, and now I'd like to give 5 minutes to my esteemed colleague from Southern Ohio, Steve Shabbat, Subcommittee on Middle East and Southeast Asia Chairman.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Before I get into a couple questions, let me tell you a personal thing that happened. For a year, I was the Republican representative from Congress to the United Nations. Each year we have one Republican and one Democrat, and it was the year after 2001, coincidentally. And we happened to be at the UN, and the topic for discussion at this UN event was human trafficking and international child abduction and that sort of thing. And we spent a lot of the day in meetings all over the place. Well, it turned out, even though that was supposed to be the topic, most of our UN diplomats spent most of the day behind the scenes trying to prevent the Arab bloc from kicking Israel out of the conference. And it seemed to be apparently just a typical day at the UN, and the UN needs to be completely overhauled. We talked about this, the Human Rights Council, and you have Cuba and Libya and the rest of them on there, probably the world's worst abusers of human rights. And I think, number one, relative to our dues, we shouldn't give a penny to the UN until they disband that Human Rights Council and completely overhaul it and completely reform it. That's just one member up here's view. But let me get to a couple questions. The UN Humanitarian Agency for Palestinian Refugees, UNRWA, refuses to vet its staff or aid recipients for ties to terrorist groups. It doesn't even think Hamas is a terrorist organization. It engages in anti-Israel and pro-Hamas propaganda, and banks with Syrian institutions designated under the USA Patriot Act for terror financing and money laundering. Why is the U.S. still UNRWA's largest single donor? Why have we given them about $500 million in the last 2 years alone? Why hasn't the U.S. publicly criticized UNRWA for these problems and withheld funding until it reforms? Given that Hamas controls security in Gaza and that Hamas has confiscated UNRWA aid packages in the past, how can we possibly guarantee that U.S. contributions to UNRWA will not end up in Hamas's hands? And I'd invite maybe two folks on the panel to take this before I get to my last question. Yes, Ms. Rosette?
You can't guarantee it. In fact, it does. A conversation I had with someone, UNRWA is headquartered in Gaza and basically provides support services for what has become a terrorist enclave. So they've actually created a terrorist welfare enclave there. And I asked, how do you vet your staff to make sure that they are not terrorist members of Hamas? The answer I was given was, we check them against the UN 1267 list. That sounds very impressive, unless you happen to know that the 1267 list is Al-Qaeda, which is maybe a problem in Gaza, but it's not the main problem. The problem is Hamas. The UN has no definition of terrorist. Therefore, what that means is it does not recognize Hamas or Hezbollah as terrorists. In other words, there really is no way. They don't check. In order for you to check, you would have to ask for a full accounting of who exactly is spending the money in Gaza. And may I just say, in looking at the things that do come out of UNRWA that are visible, I pondered, I came across a UNICEF country appeal in which they were asking donations from inside Iran for a Gaza appeal. Remember, Iranian-backed terrorist Hamas runs Gaza, where UNRWA is headquartered.
Not to interrupt you, but let me go and get to my last question. I appreciate the response.
Sure.
But in September, the United Nations is scheduled to hold an anniversary celebration of the infamous Durban Conference on Racism, taking place only days after the 10th anniversary of the September 11th attacks on this nation. This Durban III conference is likely to feature the same hateful anti-American and anti-Israel rhetoric that characterized the previous two conferences. Canada and Israel have both announced that they will not attend, but the U.S. administration has refused to announce a boycott of the event. Shouldn't the U.S. immediately join Israel and Canada in announcing that it will not participate in or support Durban 3? And isn't there no hope that the conference will will address real issues of racism, given that it will be commemorating the biased Durban Declaration of 2001? And shouldn't we finally give up on this failed Durban process and seek credible alternatives? I got 30 seconds, so yes, sir.
I think that that's entirely likely. In fact, the Obama administration boycotted the Durban 2 conference because of concern that it was not going to be addressing the issues in an unbiased fashion in regards to Israel. And that's likely to occur again. I'm kind of startled that they haven't made a strong statement in that regard and announced a boycott already. One thing I will mention is that that conference and UNRWA also receive money through the UN regular budget, so it's assessed, and the U.S. withholding is extremely impeded by this assessed process. If we decide to withhold our proportional amount to UNRWA or to this conference from the UN regular budget, again, it gets spread around, and therefore the U.S. Target of that withholding is insulated from that effort. So we need to spin these activities outside and have them be voluntarily funded.
Thank you.
And now I'd like to turn over to my good friend from Rhode Island, Mr. Cicilline, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to first associate myself with remarks of our ranking member and recognizing that we have much work to do in reforming the United Nations, and thank him for identifying some of those issues. I think we all recognize we live in an increasingly complex and interconnected world with a growing global economy, and so I think we have a responsibility to figure out how we strengthen and improve the operations of the United Nations. And one of the areas and the questions I want to ask relate to the peacekeeping function of the United Nations, recognizing that the United Nations peacekeepers are in 14 of the most dangerous places in the world and has the second largest deployed military presence in the world, and looking at kind of the cost, because a lot of this is a conversation about costs. We spend in this country in 2010, $70 billion in Afghanistan, and over the last 10 years have spent over $1 trillion in Iraq and Afghanistan. There was a GAO study that said that the UN is 8 times less expensive than if the U.S. were to do much of this work unilaterally. The RAND Corporation said that the UN has been effective as a peacekeeping force. And so in light of that, and in light of the fact that under both President Bush, both Democratic and Republican administrations, there seems to have been an increased number of missions in terms of the peacekeeping function. I just want to hear from the witnesses about, are there improvements that need to be made in that area? It seems to be effective, certainly cost effective in terms of what we would spend if we were to engage in unilateral action. And are there, so is that something that there's some consensus on the panel that that's a function that is bringing peace to the world, doing it in a cost-efficient way, and at a cost, it isn't as if we do nothing. We'd have to respond to some of these issues, and at a cost sometimes 8 times as expensive. Is that a fair analysis?
Thank you, Congressman, for your question. I would say that, first of all, there is room for improvement in terms of peacekeeping. The Secretary General has launched a 5-year strategy to ensure that we better have the capability to launch peacekeeping missions quickly, and that the costs associated with running the missions are shared between missions through regional centers. So there are concrete measures that are being considered that we can move forward with to make the missions themselves more efficient and more cost-effective. The other point I would note is that the UN does have strong special political missions in Afghanistan and Iraq. And as we think about our extensive involvement in both of those countries and the presence of American troops, the UN will be there for a decade to come, working with the governments promoting peace and stability and security, so that when American troops come home, we leave behind strong and effective governments that can combat terrorism in both of those countries. And I think that that's an important role for the UN to play moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you.
UN peacekeeping operations often support U.S. interests. There's nobody, I don't think, that would deny that characterization. But I think that the analysis that was provided by those studies is somewhat subject to an inherent assumption that I don't think is true. And that is the assumption that the United States would be conducting these operations if the UN weren't. I don't think that that's necessarily the case. I think that the decision would go to U.S. interests. But that being said, the UN operations there often do support U.S. interests, if not U.S. core interests that would lead to a U.S. direct intervention. But that UN peacekeeping also has a number of flaws, and there are a number of things that need to be addressed substantially. An OIS report audit of $1 billion in UN peacekeeping found that over a quarter of it, $265 million, was subject to waste, corruption, fraud, and abuse. A 2007 OIS report examined $1.4 billion in peacekeeping contracts and turned up significant corruption schemes that tainted $619 million, or over 40% of that amount, in terms of the contracts due to corruption. An audit of the UN mission in Sudan revealed tens of millions of dollars lost to mismanagement, waste, and substantial indications of fraud and corruption. So there is a lot that needs to be done here, and not enough has been done to address these problems. And on the issue of sexual abuse and misconduct, all too often the UN fails to hold these individuals to account for their sexual misconduct and their criminality. They are often sent home, but very, very rarely are there any cases pursued or any of these individuals brought to trial or punished for their crimes.
Thank you. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. And now I'd like to give 5 minutes to the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Duncan.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. First off, let me say that I appreciate the comments made by that distinguished gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Smith, and thank him for the passion with which he makes them. That hit home with me and actually answered one of the questions that I was going to address the panel. So let's turn back to the budgeting and financing issues, and I'll address my comments to Mr. Schaefer first. I agree with many of the members and presenters here today that reforms to UN financing and budgeting is an absolute necessity. I think that we must ensure as Congress and stewards of taxpayer dollars that they are well spent and well accounted for. So given the level of support that the United States gives to the UN and taken with a relatively small amount contributed by other member states, could you address the possibility of a weighted voting system, which would assure that the U.S. has more input on how taxpayer dollars are spent? I know you addressed those in your comments, but I'd like to have those on the record.
Sure. There are a number of different options that could be explored in terms of giving major contributors more influence over UN budgetary decisions. In the 1980s, the U.S. Congressional legislation led the U.S. to seek weighted voting on UN budgetary matters, so that if the U.S. pays 22% of the UN regular budget, it would have 22% of the weighted vote in terms of approving that budget. That was opposed by the UN, but the Reagan administration succeeded in getting what was a compromise, wherein the UN budget would only be adopted by a consensus vote. That was able to, through that process and the U.S. policy of a zero nominal growth budget, the U.S. was able to oppose budget increases and constrain UN budget growth in the late 1980s and 1990s. But it wasn't actually able to reduce things, because even though the U.S. could stop an increase, other countries could stop a reduction. And so you essentially had a tug of war that kept things at a status quo. That consensus-based agreement, the informal agreement of adopting the budget by consensus, was shattered in recent years. The U.S. presented a number of proposals for reducing the UN budget, and eventually a budget was proposed that the U.S. opposed. It voted no, and that budget was approved over the objection of the United States. And so that consensus process no longer exists. And the UN could do this without any kind of repercussions, because the teeth behind the consensus voting agreement was a legislation that said if the UN adopted a budget over the objection of the United States or without this process in place, it would be subject to financial withholding. That legislation was removed in the early 1990s, and so now there's no repercussions for doing that. So even though the consensus budget was successful in a certain way in terms of constraining UN budget growth, it wasn't successful in what we would like to do, I think, in terms of trying to go through the UN budget and and eliminate funding for duplicative or outdated mandates and spinning certain things out of the UN budget. So I would do a couple things. First is I would try and seek a dual key approval of the UN budget, one, approval by 2/3 of the UN member states, but also requiring 2/3 approval of the contributions to the UN regular budget. So you have major contributors having to approve the budget alongside the bulk of the UN member states. But more importantly, I would focus on trying to spin as much of the independent activities of the UN out of the regular budget, so you just focus it on the core support of the UN Secretariat, of the Security Council, of the General Assembly, of the International Court of Justice, and so forth, the core organizations of the United Nations, and spin out activities like the Human Rights Council and the regional commissions, the various human rights committees, UNEP, UNRWA, all these other organizations that are funded through the UN regular budget, and have them be funded voluntarily. That gives Congress much more discretion in terms of financing programs that it thinks support U.S. interests and withholding funding from programs that do not.
Okay. Thank you. In the balance of my time, I'd like to ask quickly, Ms. Rosette, you made a statement a minute ago that struck me, that we don't have a good accounting of how the money is spent. What's the process of getting that started? I think congressional oversight would like to see a detailed accounting of the money spent in the UN.
You would have to find a way to get the UN to actually put it in and produce. I would say the more specific request or demand is made outlining what really has to be there, the better. Because if you leave it to their discretion, you will end up with the, again, I refer you to the back of my written testimony, the sample one-page document disclosing nothing that pretends to be financial disclosure. You would probably have to hand them the template. Here's what we want. And what you will find, I'll give you one example. The UN flagship agency, the UN Development Program, which was involved in the North Korea Cash for Kim scam, they have procurement websites which look, they have a main website which looks quite neat if you just look at it, until you start looking for things that actually matter. Until you, for instance, start asking, and what exactly did they ship into Iran last year with their UN immunities, this agency that shipped dual-use parts that could be used for missile production to North Korea, and you won't find anything. You would need to specify what are exactly what you want to see, and I would strongly recommend, we see UN budgets, and even that is like deciphering Sanskrit.
Thank you.
You would need to ask spending.
Thank you. And now I'd like to give 5 minutes to the gentlelady from California, Mrs. Bass.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to thank the witnesses for taking their time to present testimony today. I'm struggling with the idea of the U.S. withholding funding, and wanted to know if you could articulate a little more. We have done that in the past, and I'd like for you to elaborate on how we were able to impact reforms when we withheld funding before. And then if we did do that, what does that do to our standing, internationally? And if you think about the Iran sanctions that made it through the Security Council, if we were to withhold funding, then what kind of position would that put us in when we then obviously want the UN to have those sanctions? And maybe you have some other examples of how we could impact reforms that didn't involve withholding funds.
I'd be happy to talk about that. In my written testimony, I actually go through a number of examples of historical instances where Congress has used its financial leverage to get the United Nations to adopt specific reforms. One was the Kasbom-Solomon in the 1980s, which led to the consensus-based voting process, which helped constrain U.S. budget growth in the 1980s and 1990s. A second was congressional withholding, demanding that the UN create an Inspector General equivalent organization. That led directly to the creation of the Office of Internal Oversight Services in 1994. And third was the Helms-Biden legislation, wherein the U.S. agreed to pay U.S. arrears to the United Nations in return for certain specific reforms, including reductions in the U.S. level of assessment for the regular budget and for peacekeeping. Under that agreement, the UN was supposed to reduce the U.S. peacekeeping assessment to 25%. It never reached that level, though it did get within 2 percentage points back in 2009. More recently, the UN has actually reversed pace and increased the U.S. assessment for UN peacekeeping to over 27.1%. So we're seeing some backtracking on the part of the UN in terms of the reforms that they agreed to in return for Helms-Biden. But so you do see that there are specific pieces of congressional legislation and a specific response by the United Nations that is tied to that legislative request. Other types of UN reform have been pursued, but often it is out of a fear that Congress may do something about the issue. For instance, the Volcker Commission was created to investigate the Iraqi oil for food program, and that was created specifically because Congress was becoming very, very interested in pursuing the matter itself, and so the UN took preemptive action and created the commission. You could also say that UN peacekeeping rules and regulations, while insufficient still, were adopted in part because Congress was focusing through hearings and other pieces of legislation on that problem. So I think Congress has a vital role to play in pressing for UN reform. In terms of how it affects our diplomacy, there's no doubt that pressing for budgetary cuts and UN reform ruffles feathers at the United Nations. They'd much rather spend their time focusing on other things. But that is a long-term issue, and the administrations historically have focused on short-term political priorities, passing a resolution, getting something immediately done to address a more imminent problem from their perspective. Congress has a more longer-term perspective on this, and I think that's where they complement each other. Congress can play a bad cop role, the administration and State Department diplomats can play a good cop role. And by having Congress standing backwards and playing the heavy, it can actually improve prospects for reform in the United Nations.
So then you're not necessarily suggesting that we completely defund
No.
UN? Just threaten?
No, I think we should withhold to try and spur specific reforms, but I'm not saying withhold every single dime that we give to the United Nations. I think that a lot of the things that the UN does are very useful and support U.S. interests. But there's no doubt in my mind that a number of reforms that have been advocated in the past remain undone. Some talk has been made about the UN Ethics Office. Yeah, they created a UN Ethics Office, but almost immediately the authority of that office was challenged by the United Nations Development Program. The Ethics Office found that its retaliation against a whistleblower was illegitimate, demanded UNDP to take certain actions to repair that issue, and UNDP rejected the authority of the UN Ethics Office. The Secretary General, instead of backing his own ethics office, backed UNDP. And now you have divergent ethics standards throughout the UN system, and NGOs that analyze this issue say they're completely inadequate and weak compared to international standards. So, and more recently, the investigator, the OIOS official in charge of investigations, was charged with retaliation against 2 whistleblowers himself, and he rejected the authority of the Ethics Office itself. So there's a question of whether the Ethics Office even has authority within the UN Secretariat.
Thank you.
Thank you. And now I'd like to give 5 minutes to my good friend from California, Mr. Roy, Subcommittee on Terrorism, Nonproliferation, and Trade, the chairman.
Thank you. Brett, Mr. Schaefer, the case you were talking about, was that the North Korean case or the...
in terms of UNDP and
the example you just gave?
Yes,
yes. Well, I'd like to ask Claudia Rosette about this because she's reported for many years on this situation with respect to North Korea. One of the things I remember is talking to a defector from North Korea who had worked in the missile program, and he said every time we ran short of hard currency, and we couldn't purchase on the market the equipment we needed for the missile technology. We had to wait until the regime could come up with more hard currency. The part that concerns me about this whole process, $6 billion spent by the UNDP per year, half of it in authoritarian regimes, right? According at least to Freedom House, half of it in authoritarian regimes. We're learning more and more about how that money is spent in countries like Iran, Zimbabwe. We have concerns about how it's spent in Syria, Venezuela, but North Korea in particular is a case where I guess if we thought that this currency was going for fine wine and sushi for the dear leader, it would be one thing. But the suspicions that the use of the hard currency and the documentary evidence, and that's what I'd like to get into here for a little bit with you, Claudia. Basically, it was a case of the checkbook for the UNDP being turned over to the regime. The CFO was, picked by the regime. And when somebody blew the whistle on this, the UNDP
unanimously, just as they have in every other case, circled the wagons to basically try to cover this up. But North Korea was able to use the UNDP to procure dual-use items in the name of development, and then they got their hands on equipment that happens to also be used to develop and target and test missiles. And that's the part that really makes us wonder about the amount of contribution we made here in the United States. I think about $290 million a year or more than that. We're one of the top 3 donors into this program, and yet we have no ability to get across to the UNDP that, we're not going to finance our own suicide here by allowing hard currency to get in to the development of nuclear weapons or how to deliver them with missiles. So, I guess the questions I'd ask Claudia is, I remembered they temporarily shut this down, and then it started right up. So how much money now is moving into North Korea? Is Kim Jong-il still able to pick the CFO for this position? I don't know the answer to that. What's going on with the program today? How much do we know?
Well, once again, we don't know enough. I will tell you a few things about the UN Development Program, which ran this office in North Korea and is now running it again. 2 years ago, its governing body at the UN, a 36-member executive board, was chaired by Iran. This was while Iran was having the murderous riots in the streets. Iran still sits on the board. When Kashmir Kim broke, North Korea was sitting on the board. This is the flagship UN agency and so on. And I am actually less concerned with the exact amount that is going in, of dollars that is going into this program in North Korea, than with the abilities it gives the UNDP office in Pyongyang and North Korea to bring in items, or UNDP in Iran, which we have no insight into right now. These places only become transparent when there's a major inquiry, and it took more than a year and a half to pry out of the UN the information that finally told us that the UNDP had been bringing things like a satellite image receiving station into North Korea. North Korea is a starving, poor country. Certainly the people there need help. Government there puts the military first. You don't need to be bringing that kind of equipment in. That was clearly a North Korean shopping list, which UNDP rushed to procure for them. One thing that that Congress might do is ask the Bureau of Commerce to produce something I can't get. It's confidential. The export licenses for all UN purchasing abroad, because that will show you what the UN is requisitioning. At least in this country, you might get a glimpse. I venture to guess it would make your jaw drop. And it would be useful if other countries would produce similar lists. The point I think is really important to get across here is the UN is a brilliant machine for laundering goods and money across borders with no oversight.
Thank you.
That needs looking at.
We will do that, Madam Chair. This committee will do that, and I appreciate the testimony of the panel.
Thank you. And now I would like to turn my attention to our good friend from Missouri, Mr. Carnahan.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I want to thank our chair and ranking member for holding this hearing, our witnesses for being here. I believe it's very important that the U.S. is at the table, at the UN, at the table, engaged in various international organizations. Even though the issues are complex, the parties are difficult, and the bureaucracies entrenched at the UN, I think we have to be looking at ways to best leverage the U.S. involvement, and I think also to best exercise congressional oversight. So I appreciate you all being part of this process. I wanted to ask Mr. Neuer. The Human Rights Council has properly come up in this discussion today. Last year, we had a hearing on the rise of anti-Semitism around the world, and the Council clearly came up in those conversations. There's been some very well-directed and well-founded criticisms of the Council, but there also have been some successes and some improvements in the Council with our involvement. And I wanted to ask your assessment on the progress that's been made since we have rejoined, and whether or not you think we could have made these improvements if we were not at the table. And do you think that were the U.S. to leave the Council, would that stymie further progress?
Thank you. The changes that have been made, in our view, have been mere specks on a radar screen for a situation that is abysmal. And as I presented in my oral summary and my written testimony, the state of human rights at the UN is a disaster at the Human Rights Council. And so in terms of U.S. involvement, as the ranking member read from my prepared statement, we certainly salute the determined efforts of the U.S. mission in Geneva. They are trying their best. They are doing what they can. They have tried to defend principles, to defend human rights groups who bring victims, and so forth. There have been a number of resolutions, which we welcome, on Ivory Coast recently, on Kyrgyzstan, and on one or two others. These resolutions haven't had the strength of some other resolutions. They haven't all been condemnatory. The one on Kyrgyzstan, for example, was introduced regarding a situation that had happened under a previous government, so it wasn't necessarily the most courageous text in condemning a sitting government and holding it accountable. And that's been a pattern that we've seen on some resolutions that appear to be meaningful, but in fact are critical of prior governments. Again, we encourage U.S. efforts, and we want them to do far more. And as we said, we still don't understand why nothing has been introduced on Iran. Actually, we've crunched the numbers. As you know, there is a resolution in the General Assembly that is adopted each year. It's run by Canada, and it passes in the General Assembly in New York. And if you run the numbers, actually, in theory, if the missions in Geneva would vote the same way, the 47 countries, you would have more yes votes than no votes. So actually, with significant diplomacy, we could have a resolution on Iran that would pass. It wouldn't be easy. Why is it not being introduced? I don't know the answer to that question. I hope it will be introduced, and I hope we'll see the creation of a special investigator on the massacres that have taken place in Iran. To summarize, we have always supported robust engagement. UN Watch was founded by a former United States ambassador, Morris Abram, who was a civil rights leader as well. We've always believed in the value of U.S. leadership and engagement, and in our recommendations that we submitted here last year, which was co-sponsored by a bipartisan group, Representative Engel and Congresswoman Ross-Lehtinen, we set forth numerous recommendations for what the U.S., working in concert with the European allies, need to do. And fundamentally, it's to take the offensive. It's not to allow the abusers of veto and to only introduce that which will pass. That will really limit it to countries of little influence. As I said, Iran, China, Syria, the list goes on, have all been ignored. That is something that is not satisfactory.
Thank you. And quickly to Mr. Yo, with regard to the Millennium Development Goals, your colleague Kathy Colvin testified last year at our hearing. I'd like to hear your thoughts on how the UN can best partner with the private sector and what U.S. engagement has meant to those efforts.
Sure. I would say that as we think about shrinking national budgets for foreign aid and foreign assistance, public-private partnerships, including corporations around the world who wish to support the MDGs and the UN's work, are very important. It's something that we try to facilitate at UNF. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, and now I'd like to give 5 minutes to my good friend from North Carolina, Mrs. Elmers.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thank you, panel, for being with us today. I just want to ask my questions in regard to some of the corruption issues, and I'm going to address my question to Mr. Appleton. But I would like to state this. You must understand the concerns of the American people, the hard-working taxpayers who are the ones who are funding you, the UN. And when it comes to these issues of corruption and misconduct, it's hard for us. And I can tell you the people of North Carolina, District 2, are very concerned about this issue. So again, to Mr. Appleton, you tried to oversee and help reform the UN and uncover over $1 billion in tainted contracts. And as thanks, you got fired and blocked from being hired for further jobs there. And many of your cases remain open and unaddressed at this time. Is this what generally happens when a UN investigator takes this course? And can you discuss with us today what happened to your appointment to be the lead investigator at the UN's Office of Internal Oversight Services?
Well, thank you very much. Again, I'm honored to have been asked to appear. I think in 3 minutes it's tough to describe the overall dynamic of oversight in the UN and conducting investigations, but I'll give it a shot. I think conducting true, real, deep investigations to ferret out the actual facts and circumstances is not a best way of career advancement in the UN. And it's a reason why I think you'll see a number of Inspector General type offices in many of these international organizations that do not, aren't very aggressive, because you can see what happens. I mean, you do not make a lot of friends, and if you pick the wrong subject, it could have very fatal consequences. So what's critical for oversight in the UN is complete independence. I mean, not just operational independence, but budgetary independence. So ultimately, your funding is not at risk, your career is not at risk, your job is not at risk, because otherwise, if it is, what advantage is it for you to pursue real and honest and objective investigations? Historically, and I think I would agree with some of what Mr. Schaefer said about focus of this Congress, and when there is focus, it can happen properly. And there are episodes where sometimes privileges and immunities have been waived and cases have been advanced. But if there isn't an eye and a focus and attention on the issues, they're not, in my experience, not going to advance. You've got to have a will, and you've got to have an apparatus and machinery that protects investigators from retaliation. I'm not saying you don't hold them to a certain standard. I mean, there's no question. The investigations have to be genuine, integrous, unbiased. No question about that. And I think, but the way to challenge them is through a judicial mechanism that is properly functioning. So you need all of these apparatus. I mean, a strong and effective independent oversight office also has to be complemented and supplemented by an effective ethics office, a sound judicial machinery, an effective an appeals process, and an effective sanctions and penalty regime. So all of that needs to be put in place. And what had been started, it seemed to have faltered and gone into reverse. So the way in which the dynamic is, it does not set the atmosphere for thorough and deep and intense inquiries. With respect to my own situation, I guess it's I respectfully would say that because the case is in the judicial system, I really can't speak too much about it, other than the fact that this was an example of a lack of independence of the Undersecretary General, who attempted to went through proper procedures, conducted a recruitment exercise, presented my nomination, and it was not accepted. So her argument certainly is, and she's very forceful advocate of this, that there's a real example of a lack of true independence in oversight, that you need to be able to appoint your own staff. So, thank you.
Thank you, and now I'd like to give 5 minutes to my good friend from Nebraska, Mr. Fortenberry.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for the time. Thank you all for coming today. Given the drama of the institution, perhaps we could start a new reality TV show and call it the UN Makeover or something like that. With it said, seriously, let me say, I think it's important for the United States to belong to multilateral institutions. The world is complex, but without some platforms for the development of mutual understanding, we could be in a worse off situation in spite of the effrontery that we sometimes have to endure in this particular multilateral entity. With that said, I'd like to point out what I perceive to be some of the UN's strengths, and I think some of you spoke to this. Perhaps you could confirm that. And then I'd like to try to unpack further the reforms that could be engaged that would actually strengthen the part of the institution that makes sense, but either jettison or rethink the other components that are causing such serious problems. I was in the country of Liberia a little while back and had a one-on-one chat with a UN peacekeeper, a Nigerian who was in a blue helmet, way out on an outpost in the interior of the country. He was very well informed as to what his mission was and how he would carry it out, and I was impressed. And it does seem to me that the UN peacekeeping forces around the world provide a stabilization factor, sometimes imperfectly, but a stabilization factor that is very important. Secondly, the UN is very well positioned to provide humanitarian outreach, particularly in crisis times, and I think that's very important work, and it seems to be a strength of the institution. Now, with that said, we've talked about a lot of the other difficulties, one being the Human Rights Council. Since the U.S. has joined, we've not even offered a resolution condemning the human rights abuses of China and Cuba. And so, with that said, how can we unpack this further that looks at the institution from the portions of it that are really viable, potentially reforms or gets us away from or shames or withholds money, as you suggested, Ms. Rosette, in the areas that are, again, give real effrontery. Or third is, are there other multilateral institutions that can begin to replace that which cannot be reformed in the internal dynamics of the institution? Yes.
The internal dynamics have a certain mathematics and logic where it would be nice to believe, for instance, that the Human Rights Council can be sort of brought around like a super tanker. But if you actually look at the makeup of the General Assembly, we need to wait until the change of the character of the majority of nations on the planet before that actually happens. And the essence of success in the modern world really is competition. And I think turning to some alternative grouping in which you are not obliged to haggle with Cuba and Russia and China over how to define human rights is something that might be very productive and at the end of the day would also honor the people whose rights you're actually trying to protect. Because as you know, on the ground, it translates into complete abandonment. These things that sound academic when they're discussed in the council, talk to people from Zimbabwe who live under the kinds of rules that need to be addressed. So competition makes a great difference.
Do you foresee any current institution that might fulfill that role or some emerging fledgling institution that could do that in the near term?
Where you are not constrained by the UN membership, problems. One other note, peacekeeping also can have the very dangerous drawback that it sounds as if something is being done. At the moment, the ramped up UNIFIL mission in Lebanon, the peacekeepers in Lebanon, who remember were needing rescue from their bunkers after Hezbollah built up weapons nests around them.
I said, albeit imperfectly.
They're rearming again, and I think it is a question that needs to be very seriously asked. Is it more dangerous to have them there, giving the illusion that they are protecting things, waiting until the next rescue?
Thank you. I'm sorry, I'm running out of time. Yes.
I think it's just important to note that the UN is not the only multilateral option, and that multilateral activities are not legitimate only if they go through the United Nations. You take a look at an organization like the Proliferation Security Initiative, which was introduced by the Bush administration to counter trafficking in weapons of mass destruction. If you take a look at ad hoc interventions by the AU, by NATO forces around the world, you can do peacekeeping, you can do interventions outside of the UN framework. And if the reforms are not adopted to implement membership standards for the Human Rights Council, I think the U.S. and other countries should seriously consider creating a non-UN human rights body so that you can keep the worst violators of human rights off of that body and really dig into the human rights issues and confront human rights abusers.
That may be the answer here. I'm sorry I'm out of time. Thank you.
Thank you. And without objection, the full written statements of all of our briefers will be made as part of the record. Members may have up to 5 days to submit their statements for the record. And to my good friend from California, do you have any more witnesses, sir?
I do, but I didn't bring them with me.
Okay, well, thank you. In the full interest, do we have any more witnesses in the back room? Can somebody check before I gavel this down?
Members or?
Members, I mean. I'm new at this. No more members? All right. This briefing is now closed, and again, members have up to 5 days for written statements, and your prepared remarks as well. Thank you very much, gentlemen and lady, for your attention in this matter.